Ganyu has quickly gone from being Cryo Amber to instead being Cryo Klee, and we couldn't be happier about this as it gives us another reason to stare at her. She is arguably now one of the best main DPS as well as support character in Genshin Impact, and with good gear, she makes all the currently available content in the game very trivial. Cryo is one of the most powerful elements in Genshin Impact, especially since the introduction of the new Cryo set, which grants you up to 40% crit rate against frozen enemies. The only downside to a Cryo main DPS is that when it procs Melt, it can only go up to 150% damage, as opposed to triggering Melt with power characters, which does 200% damage instead. Nonetheless, Ganyu's scaling is so high, she still outputs very similar damage to Klee, Child, and Diluc. In this guide, I will explain how to build Ganyu for both a main DPS build as well as a support build, with using Ganyu at Constellation 0 in mind. I will explain the different stat priorities you should be focusing on her gear and go over her best weapon choices as well as artifact sets. Lastly, I will give a few gameplay and team comp tips on how to use her to her max potential. Also, before going any further in this video, I just want to remind you guys that we have a mission where we are going to go through every single character in Genshin Impact and make a character guide in depth explaining the different builds and how to play them to their maximum potential. We have about half of the characters done so far, so make sure to check it out. And if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to our channel as it would mean a lot to us. Lastly, we also have our own Discord server with almost 4,000 people, and we run giveaways every single month for Genshin Impact where we give battle passes and welcome moons to dozens of players. So if you're interested, make sure to check out the link in the description and come over, as well as we live streamed and have even more giveaways on our live streams. So we'd love to see you come and join us for those. The main part of Ganyu's kit as a DPS is going to be her charge shots, which deal very high cryo damage. Additionally, when held long enough, it will proc a Frost Flake Bloom that will explode and deal additional AoE cryo damage with insanely high scaling. This is what differentiates her from other archer DPS, as it basically gives her double cryo damage effects on her charge attacks and deals major AoE damage. Remember Amber's skills that throws an obnoxious looking lowly amber on the ground that taunts enemies until it explodes? Well, her elemental skill is almost the same, but with cryo damage instead. When casting this ability, Ganyu will also dash backward and deal some initial cryo damage as well. This is a great ability to taunt enemies and go away so that you can do charge shots peacefully without getting hit. As for Ganyu's ult, this is one of the main reasons why she can also be played so efficiently as a support. It creates a huge AoE area where icicles will keep falling on the ground, dealing AoE cryo damage and make Hilichurls cry at night when dreaming about Ganyu. These icicles both automatically fall on targets inside of the radius as well as randomly on the floor, and since they all cause AoE damage, multiple monsters can be hit by one icicle, so when you group all monsters together, this will deal insane amounts of damage and cryo application effects. This ability is insanely powerful, especially because the duration is 15 seconds and the cooldown is 15 seconds, which means you can have 100% uptime on this, thus enabling insane combos for freeze and melt comps. For main DPS, the leveling priorities will be normal attack first, ult second, and the skill third. For support, you will be leveling the ult first, the skill second, and normal attack last, but you don't even need to level the normal attack at all if you're using her purely as a support. Her passive talent, Undivided Heart, makes it so that after firing one charge shot, you will gain a buff for 5 seconds, granting you 20% crit rate on your subsequent charge shots. This also works on the bloom effects and refreshes every time you shoot. Her other passive talent, Harmony Between Heaven and Earth, grants 20% cryo damage to characters standing inside of Ganyu's ult radius. Ganyu is probably one of the most C0 friendly characters to have been recently released. Her first constellation will make that her fully charged shots reduce the cryo resistance of enemies by 15%, as well as providing her with 2 energy per hit. This will help her boost her damage and have her ult up consistently as a main DPS. Her second constellation gives her elemental skill a second charge, which is a nice quality of life buff, especially in abyss levels where you have to protect an objective. The fourth constellation will cause enemies standing inside of her ult radius to take increasingly more damage from all sources, up to a maximum of 25% damage. The 6th Constellation will cause the 0.01% of the Genshin community who actually unlocks this to have even wetter dreams when thinking about Ganyu, allowing them to cast fully charged aim shots after casting her elemental skill without actually having to charge them. So first, I'm going to go over Ganyu as a main DPS. As far as stat priority goes, it is quite complicated as Ganyu can be built so many different ways depending on your playstyle and what artifact you choose to use, but in general, crit rate is a very important stat for Ganyu, but you can gain 75% crit rate for free without having it on any of your gear. This is done through Cryo Resonance, which gives you 15% crit rate on enemies frozen or affected by cryo, as well as you can get up to 40% crit rate on enemies frozen if you are using Blizzard Strayer 4-piece set. And on top of that, the Undivided Heart passive talent also gives her 20% crit rate for her charge shots. It is also important to note that when shooting at enemies' head or weak points, you have always 100% crit chance, which all in all makes it so that building crit rate on a DPS Ganyu can be potentially wasteful in a lot of scenario, especially if you are good at aiming. For this reason, I do not recommend building much crit rate on her gear for optimal builds. You can obviously still do so, but generally you can try and get it only from substats and do perfectly fine. So for DPS, the stats that I would recommend is attack percentage or elemental mastery on the sands, cryo damage percentage on the goblet, and crit damage percentage on the circlet. Perfect substats for her would be crit damage, attack percentage, elemental mastery, and crit rate, depending on how you build her. Elemental mastery is just useful if you are going to be building her in a heavy melt comp, as it will boost the damage of her melt effects more than anything else. As far as weapons are concerned, Amos Bow is without a doubt the best weapon for her. This has been heavily tested by the Ganyu mains community, the reason being that the Frostflake Arrow Bloom effect is delayed and takes at least 0.3 seconds to hit, which benefits heavily from the passive of Amos Bow. This also stacks with the actual travel time of the arrow, making it so that you almost always get the max percentage damage buff from Amos Bow's passive, which is 52% damage at rank 1. Next, of course, Skyward Harp is the obvious second choice, being a 5-star that has both crit rate and crit damage, as well as a powerful passive. Stringless is also a very good option if you are building Ganyu for melt comps, as you will benefit heavily from the elemental mastery as well as the extra damage on your skill and your ult. If you are not going for melt comp, Blackcliff Warbow is going to be one of the best 4-star options available through the Starglitter shop, as it provides crit damage and a powerful passive. Lastly, Prototype Crescent is also a very good option, being that it's craftable, so when Mario stops trolling you and you get enough materials to get it to R5, it will be a very powerful weapon that also has good effect for charge shots. As far as artifacts are concerned, different choices will depend heavily on what you as a Ganyu simp prefer in terms of gameplay, but the general consensus is that the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer is the obvious choice, granting her up to 40% crit rate in freeze comps, as well as 15% cryo damage, which is huge. If you choose this, you will most likely not need to build any crit rate on any of your gear, but you will have to build your team appropriately in order to be able to freeze enemies consistently. 2-piece Blizzard Strayer and 2-piece Gladiator is another very decent option if you do not want to play freeze comps. 15% cryo damage and 18% attack are generally great buff for her damage, and it is more consistent and easier to play. Though when you are going this route, you might have to build some crit rate on your gear. 4-piece Wanderer's Troop is the best option if you are going purely for a melt comp, as it grants elemental mastery and increased damage to your charge shots. Other options can also include 4-piece Bolide set, as for the early game, Berserker is also very valuable. Now, if you are building Ganyu as a support character only, you will rely mostly on having 100% uptime on your ult for permanent cryo effects. This means that you will need about 160% energy recharge as long as your ult is hitting more than 1 or 2 monsters and that you cast your E often. You can achieve this very easily with having energy recharge on either your sand or your weapon, as well as on some of the substats, and you will have plenty of energy recharge that way. Support Ganyu is the best cryo character for melt comps. With a power character as your main DPS, you will have 100% of cryo uptime, granting them infinite melts and a lot of extra damage. Also note that as a support, you do not get much of the crit rate bonuses except from resonance if you're using 2 cryo in your party, so you might want to build some crit rate to benefit from all the crit damage that she gains passively. For support Ganyu, you will want to go energy recharge or attack percentage on the sands, cryo damage on the goblet, and crit rate or crit damage on the circlet, depending on how well your substats have rolled for crit rate. The perfect substats for her would obviously be crit rate and crit damage, as well as attack percentage and energy recharge. Now, as far as weapons go for a support Ganyu, Skyward Harp would obviously be the optimal option, as it is insanely powerful of a weapon, granting both crit damage and crit rate, but unless you're a mega whale, you most likely do not have Skyward Harps laying around for support characters, so in that case, Stringless would be the best option for the common people. It is a very good weapon that boosts your ult and skill damage, as well as has a decent base damage itself. If you do build Stringless, you will want to put energy recharge on your sands or on a lot of your substats in order to get full ult uptime. Blackcliff Warbow, as well as the BP weapon, are other amazing options for her as well for a higher damage output, though you have to make sure that you build your gear accordingly to balance your crit rate and crit damage ratio, as well as build energy recharge on your artifacts. Otherwise, Favonius Warbow and Sacrificial Bow are both amazing options for support Ganyu. In that way, you do not have to build energy recharge on any of your gear, and you will be able to have 100% uptime on your ult. Note that Favonius Warbow's passive, which grants energy recharge through orbs when you crit, does not work when she is not present on the field, so it is not that big of a buff, as you will not usually leave Ganyu out in the field after casting your abilities. Now, as far as artifacts are concerned, for support Ganyu, 2-piece Blizzard Strayer and 2-piece Noblesse Oblige is probably the most viable option. It directly buffs all of her damage as well as her ult, which is what you use her for. Otherwise, 4-piece Noblesse Oblige is also a great option, being the ultimate support set in Genshin Impact, and due to how often you will be casting her ult, the buff that it gives will have very high uptime on your party. There are also a lot of other sets you can be using, especially in the early game, but as a support, there really isn't any way you can go wrong, though those two options are definitely the best options. Now, for team comps and tips, as previously stated, you can play Ganyu in many different ways. In a freeze comp, you will definitely need a Hydro character to apply freeze consistently. Mona, Chinshu, and Child are all very viable for this role. Child is obviously much better as a main DPS than a support, but if you have C4 on him, his Riptide procs will make Ganyu freeze enemies very easily, and he is probably the best character to pair with her. In a melt comp, you will be focusing on doing big PP damage with your charge shots on monsters afflicted by pyro instead, which means that the best enablers for this are going to be characters such as Klee and Xiangling, as well as Bennett, who can also be valuable. When using Ganyu as a support for melt comps, Diluc, Klee, and Bennett are going to be the best main DPS to use, as they will be benefiting from the cryo the most. Xiangling can also work, but she is usually more of a physical damage dealer when she's a main DPS, and her ult is unpredictable a little bit, which will be harder to make her be the one who procs the melt effects, but still would work just fine. Venti and Sucrose are probably the best character to bring with Ganyu, whether as a DPS or as a support, as they have effects that will drag mobs and stack them on top of each other, making Ganyu's AoE and ult insanely powerful. As well as with the Veridicent Veneer set, it will debuff their cryo resistance, making everything plainly stupid. Lastly, all these tips are obviously for optimal usage, but this is a game with a very low difficulty level, especially at higher level with decent gear and artifacts, as well as when you're using these increasingly powerful 5-star characters. This game is not very hard. As our friend Enviosity has proven, you can clear the entirety of the content in this game using only free-to-play characters while not spending a single Primogem. This means that you can literally play any team comp and character you want, as it is your business only what you do in a single player game. So just play whatever you like and enjoy the game. And let's be honest, we all know why you rolled for Ganyu, and it is most likely not for her combat capabilities. I hope you guys enjoyed this guide. Feel free to ask any questions or share any tips you have about her in the comments below. Let me know what you think so far about her and which is your favorite angle to look at her from.